They say that books are windows into other worlds. But what if I told you that some readers have walked through those windows? What if some of them knew the authors personally, held their hands, heard their laughter, witnessed their tears? Welcome to the Eternal Book Club. This is the story of how immortality changes everything we think we know about art, memory, and the weight of perspective. This is about what happens when the past refuses to stay on the page. Margot Ashford had always loved October in Boston. The way the leaves turned crimson and gold, how the Charles River reflected the dying light like molten copper. At 28, she worked as a rare books conservator at the Widener Library, spending her days with leather bindings and foxed pages, breathing in the perfume of centuries. She lived alone in a cramped apartment in Cambridge, her evenings filled with tea and whatever novel struck her fancy. Her social life was limited: a few colleagues, some college friends who'd scattered across the country, and her mother who called every Sunday without fail. So when she found the invitation slipped between the pages of a first edition of Frankenstein she was restoring, Margot assumed it was some kind of elaborate joke. The card was cream-colored, heavy stock, with elegant calligraphy that looked genuinely handwritten. You are cordially invited to join the Eternal Book Club. We meet the first Friday of every month at the Blackwood Estate, 1313 Beacon Street. This month's selection, Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. Come prepared to discuss how love transcends time, death, and all reasonable boundaries. V. Blackwood, founder. No RSVP information. No phone number. Just an address in one of Boston's oldest, most exclusive neighborhoods. Margot turned the card over in her fingers, noting the watermark, a rose entwined with thorns, so detailed she could almost see the texture of each petal. The kind of craftsmanship that didn't exist anymore. She should have thrown it away. Instead, she went home and reread Wuthering Heights for the 7th time in her life. The Blackwood estate sat behind iron gates, a Gothic revival mansion that looked like it had been transplanted directly from the Yorkshire moors. As Margot approached on that first Friday in October, she felt her pulse quicken. Every rational part of her brain screamed that this was a terrible idea, walking into a stranger's home based on a mysterious invitation. But curiosity had always been her greatest weakness. The door opened before she could knock. The woman who stood there was striking in a way that made Margot forget how to breathe. Tall, perhaps in her early 40s, with silver-white hair cut in a sleek bob and eyes the color of amber. She wore a burgundy velvet dress that belonged to another era, yet somehow looked perfectly contemporary. "Margot Ashford," the woman said, her voice like honey over gravel. "I'm so pleased you came. I'm Vivienne Blackwood. Please, come in." "How did you know I would come?" Vivienne smiled, revealing teeth just a shade too white. "Because you've read Wuthering Heights 7 times. Because you annotate your books even though you know you shouldn't. Because you understand that some stories are about more than just the words on the page. You're exactly the kind of reader we need." The entrance hall was magnificent, all dark wood paneling and oil paintings, with a grand staircase that curved upward into shadow. But what caught Margot's attention was the sound of voices, animated discussion floating from a room to the left. "The others are already here," Vivienne said, guiding her forward. "Don't be nervous. We're all readers here. That's the only thing that matters." The library was everything Margot had ever dreamed of. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a fireplace large enough to stand in, Persian rugs, and leather armchairs arranged in a circle. 5 people were already seated, holding wine glasses and paperback copies of the Bronte novel. "Everyone," Vivienne announced. "This is Margot, our newest member." A man who looked to be in his 60s stood up, extending his hand. He had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the weathered face of someone who'd spent a lifetime outdoors. "Thomas Whitmore," he said warmly. "Retired professor. Don't worry, I promise not to lecture. Well, not too much." Next was a young woman, maybe Margot's age, with dark skin and dozens of tiny braids pulled into a high ponytail. She waved enthusiastically. "Keisha Washington. I teach high school English in Dorchester. Fair warning, I have opinions with a capital O about the Bronte sisters." A man in his 30s with carefully styled dark hair and an expensive suit nodded politely. "David Chen, corporate lawyer." This is my escape from billable hours. Then there was an elderly woman with snow-white hair and a warm smile. Eleanor Hartley, dear. I've been coming to this club for 15 years. Best decision I ever made. The last person didn't stand. He sat in the shadows, his features obscured, but Margot could see pale hands holding a book, fingers that were too long, too elegant. And that's Silas Morgenstern, Vivienne said smoothly. He's been with us for quite some time. Pleasure, came a voice from the darkness, British accent, cultured and old-fashioned. Margot settled into an empty chair, accepting a glass of wine from Vivienne. The conversation resumed, and she found herself relaxing despite the strangeness of it all. Thomas started, I've always found Heathcliff's obsession troubling. The way he torments the next generation, punishing innocent children for the sins of their parents. But isn't that the point? Keisha interrupted. Bronte is showing us what happens when love curdles into hate. When grief has no healthy outlet. David leaned forward. From a legal perspective, the property machinations are actually fascinating. The way Heathcliff systematically acquires everything. You would focus on the real estate, Vivienne said with amusement. Then Silas spoke, his voice cutting through the friendly debate like a knife through silk. You're all wrong. Everyone turned. He leaned forward, finally allowing the firelight to illuminate his face, and Margot gasped despite herself. He was beautiful. Inhumanly so. Pale skin like marble, high cheekbones, dark hair that fell across his forehead. But his eyes, gray as storm clouds, held something ancient, something that made her skin prickle with instinctive warning. Heathcliff loved Catherine with the kind of desperation that only comes from truly understanding death, Silas continued. Not fearing it. Understanding it. Knowing that it's final, that it takes everything, that there's no negotiation possible. His rage isn't madness. It's the rage of someone who knows exactly what was stolen from him. The room had gone very quiet. That's... Margot found herself speaking without meaning to. That's a very specific interpretation. Silas's eyes found hers across the room. Is it? Or is it simply the truth that most readers are too young, too alive, to comprehend? Silas, Vivienne said softly, a warning in her tone. But Margot couldn't look away. You talk about death like you've experienced it. A smile played at the corners of his mouth. In a manner of speaking, Miss Ashford, I have. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of literary discussion, wine, and increasingly strange observations. Eleanor mentioned reading Jane Eyre when it was first published, then laughed and said she meant her grandmother had. David referenced meeting Kazuo Ishiguro at a conference, and Vivienne's eyes glittered with something unreadable as she murmured, Kazuo always did throw the most interesting parties. By the time Margot left at midnight, her head was spinning. She'd agreed to come back the next month. They were reading The Picture of Dorian Gray. As she walked to her car, she turned back to look at the house. Silas stood in an upper window, perfectly still, watching her. He didn't move. He didn't even appear to breathe. The next 4 weeks were torture. Margot threw herself into Dorian Gray, reading it with an intensity that surprised even her. She made notes, highlighted passages, constructed arguments about Oscar Wilde's philosophy of aestheticism and the corruption of innocence. But mostly, she thought about Silas. About the way he'd spoken of death with such intimate knowledge. About Vivienne's ageless beauty and Eleanor's slip about reading Jane Eyre in 1847. About the way none of them had eaten the elaborate spread of food that had been laid out, though they'd all drunk wine. Red wine. Dark as blood. She told herself she was being ridiculous. Reading too many vampire novels in her youth, and Rice and Stephanie Meyer and all the rest. These were just eccentric rich people who liked literature. Nothing more. But when the first Friday in November arrived, Margot found herself parking outside the Blackwood estate with her heart hammering and a copy of Dorian Gray clutched in her hands like a talisman. This time, Silas answered the door. Up close, he was even more unsettling. He moved with a fluidity that wasn't quite natural, and when he smiled at her, she noticed his canines were just slightly too long, too sharp. "Miss Ashford," he said. "Punctual. I like that. Is Vivienne here? She's finishing preparations. Please, come in. He gestured toward the library, and Margot noticed he cast no reflection in the hall mirror. No, that was impossible. The angle was wrong, or the lighting, or— You've noticed, Silas said quietly. Margot froze. Noticed what? That something is different about us. About this club. He studied her with those ancient eyes. Vivienne said you were perceptive. She was right. I don't know what you mean. Don't you? He moved closer, not threatening, but with the kind of intensity that made her breath catch. You work with old books, Margot. You understand preservation. The desperate human need to make things last beyond their natural span. What if I told you that some of us have found a way to do that with ourselves? You're saying you're— She couldn't finish the sentence. A vampire. Yes. He said it as casually as someone might say they were a vegetarian. As is Vivienne. As was Eleanor, until she chose to end her immortality 15 years ago and live out her natural life. Thomas and David and Keisha are human, like you. This club, it exists as a bridge. A place where both sides can meet and share something that transcends the boundaries between us. Margot should have run. Should have screamed. Should have done anything except what she actually did, which was laugh, a slightly hysterical sound that echoed in the hallway. This is insane. Is it? Silas tilted his head. You've suspected for weeks. Why else would you have come back? I came back because I like discussing books. True. But not the whole truth. He held out his hand. Come to the library. Vivienne will explain everything. And then you can decide whether to stay or go. We won't stop you either way. We don't trap people, Margot. We're not monsters from a story. Just monsters in real life. His smile was sad. Something like that. The library was already full. Keisha waved enthusiastically, apparently unconcerned that she was sitting next to two predators. Thomas was deep in conversation with Vivienne about the symbolism of the yellow book in Dorian Gray. David was taking notes on his tablet. Eleanor, human Eleanor, who looked every one of her 75 years now, smiled warmly at Margot. I know it's a shock, dear. I remember my first night. But I promise, you're safe here. We're all safe. That's the point of the club, it's neutral ground. Margot sank into her usual chair, and Vivienne poured her a generous glass of wine. Real wine this time, she noticed. Not blood. I owe you an explanation, Vivienne began, her voice gentle. The Eternal Book Club was founded in 1823. I was newly turned, still learning what it meant to be what I am. I'd always loved literature, and I found myself isolated. Humans couldn't understand my perspective, and other vampires of my acquaintance had no interest in books. They'd lived so long that human art seemed trivial to them. But not to you, Margot said softly. Not to me. So I started inviting people, both human and vampire, to discuss books as equals, to share our different perspectives on the same stories. Over the years, membership has changed. Humans age and leave, or die. Vampires move on to other cities, other interests. But the club continues. Silas settled into his chair. I joined in 1889. I'd been a vampire for nearly 60 years by then, and I was drowning in my own memories. Literature gave me a framework to process them. How old are you? Margot asked before she could stop herself. I was born in 1802. Turned in 1829. I'm 224 years old. The number was incomprehensible. And you've spent all that time reading? Among other things. I was a physician in my human life. I've maintained that practice in various forms over the decades, moving cities every 20 years or so to avoid suspicion. But books have been my constant companion. Thomas cleared his throat. I've been coming for 10 years. My wife died, and I was lost. A friend told me about the club, said it might help. I thought it was just a book group. Took me 3 months to realize what Vivienne and Silas were. I screamed, Keisha added cheerfully. Just full-on shrieked when Vivienne told me. But then we had the most amazing conversation about Toni Morrison, and I figured, what the hell? How often do you get to discuss Beloved with someone who actually remembers Reconstruction? David nodded. The historical perspective alone is invaluable. Last year we read All Quiet on the Western Front, and Silas had served as a medic in World War I. He could contextualize things no historian could. Margot's head was spinning. So tonight, we're just going to discuss Oscar Wilde? We're going to discuss Oscar Wilde, Vivienne confirmed, with the knowledge that I met him. Multiple times. In London and Paris. The world tilted. You knew Oscar Wilde. I did. And I can tell you that Dorian Gray was far more autobiographical than most scholars realize. Oscar was obsessed with youth, with beauty, with the idea of art superseding morality. He was also desperately afraid of aging, of losing his wit and charm. Vivienne's expression grew distant. He didn't make a literal deal with the devil, of course. But he made metaphorical ones constantly. That's what the book is about, the bargains we make to preserve ourselves, and what we lose in the process. Did you ever offer to turn him? Margot asked quietly. The room went very still. No, Vivienne said finally. Oscar was meant to burn bright and fast. Immortality would have destroyed what made him brilliant. Some people are meant to be eternal. Others are meant to be meteors. The conversation about Dorian Gray was unlike anything Margot had experienced. Vivienne talked about the aestheticism movement from the inside, describing parties where Oscar held court, where beautiful young men and women debated art and morality until dawn. She spoke of his decline, his trial, his imprisonment, not from books, but from memory. He was broken by the end, Vivienne said softly. Not just legally or socially, but spiritually. The man I knew in the 1880s, so full of life and laughter, he was gone by 1900. The question the book asks is whether that was inevitable, whether his philosophy of beautiful excess always leads to destruction, or whether society destroyed him for daring to live authentically. Silas added, I met him once, briefly, in Paris. 1899. He was dying, though he didn't know it yet. We talked about Keats, about dying young versus living long. He said. Silas paused, remembering. He said that he'd rather burn out at 40 than fade slowly into obscurity. I asked if he still believed that, given how he'd burned. He didn't answer. The conversation moved to Dorian himself, to the portrait, to the supernatural elements. It's interesting, Margot found herself saying, that Wilde chose a portrait as the mechanism. Something that preserves appearance while the soul corrupts. What's the vampire equivalent? Keisha asked, looking between Vivienne and Silas. You don't age, don't change. Is there a hidden corruption somewhere? Vivienne smiled. That's the eternal question, isn't it? Are we monsters because we kill to survive, or do we simply exist outside conventional morality? Wilde would have appreciated the ambiguity. You do kill, though, David said. It wasn't a question. We did, Silas replied. Both of us. For decades, we hunted humans. Justified it as necessary, as natural as a lion eating a gazelle. But around the turn of the 20th century, medical advances made it possible to survive on donated blood banks. We don't kill anymore. Haven't for over a century. That's a convenient timeline, Margot said before she could stop herself. Silas's eyes met hers. Yes, it is. And I regret every day that I didn't find an alternative sooner. I carry those deaths with me, Miss Ashford. Hundreds of them. Their faces, their names. That's the real curse of immortality, not aging or sunlight or any of the myths. It's perfect memory. Perfect recall of every terrible thing you've done. The weight of his confession settled over the room. Thomas broke the silence. That's why this club matters. We all carry things. Maybe not centuries of murder, but losses, regrets, moments we can't undo. Books give us a way to process that, to see ourselves in characters, to understand that others have struggled with the same darkness. Oscar wrote about that too, Vivienne said. The preface to Dorian Gray. There is no such thing as a moral or an immoral book. Books are well written, or badly written. That is all. He believed art existed beyond judgment. I'm not sure I agree anymore, but I understand the appeal of that philosophy when you've lived long enough to see morality shift and change. The discussion continued for hours, weaving between the text and personal experience, between literary analysis and philosophical debate. Margot found herself contributing, arguing, questioning. She challenged Silas's interpretation of Basil's obsession with Dorian, debated with Vivienne about whether Lord Henry was truly evil or just nihilistic, and bonded with Keisha over their shared love of Wilde's aphorisms. By the time midnight approached, Margot realized she'd forgotten to be afraid. These weren't monsters. They were readers. People, or whatever Vivienne and Silas were, who loved stories and needed them to make sense of impossible lives. As everyone gathered their things, Vivienne approached Margot. "Will you come back? Next month is Pride and Prejudice. I have extensive thoughts on Jane Austen." "You knew her too?" "Briefly. She was lovely. Wickedly funny in person. The books don't quite capture her sense of humor." Margot should have said no. Should have run back to her normal life of conservation work and solitary evenings. Instead, she said, "I'll be here." Over the next months, Margot became a fixture at the Eternal Book Club. November was Austen, and Vivienne's description of Regency-era society, the restrictions on women, the desperation of the marriage market, gave new depth to Elizabeth Bennet's rebelliousness. December brought The Great Gatsby. Silas had been in New York in the 1920s, had frequented speakeasies and watched the Jazz Age unfold. His reading of Gatsby's tragedy was colored by having seen that world firsthand. "Everyone thinks the 20s were glamorous," he said. "And they were on the surface. But underneath, so much desperation. People trying to outrun the trauma of the war, drinking and dancing and spending like there was no tomorrow. Because for many of them, there wasn't." Fitzgerald captured that, the glitter and the rot together. January was Toni Morrison's Beloved. Keisha led the discussion, her passion for Morrison's work evident in every word. But it was Vivienne who provided the most haunting perspective. "I was in Ohio in the 1850s, she said quietly. "I saw slavery. Not in the abstract, not in books, I saw it. The auctions, the separations, the violence. I could have stopped some of it. I had power, strength, influence. But I did nothing. I told myself it wasn't my fight, that I was a monster anyway, that human affairs didn't concern me." Her voice broke. Morrison writes about how trauma haunts us, how the past literally intrudes on the present in the form of beloved's ghost. That's truth. The past doesn't stay buried. It comes back again and again, until we face it. I've been facing it for over a century. The silence was profound. "Why didn't you act?" David asked, not accusatory, just genuinely curious. "Cowardice. I was afraid of exposure, of drawing attention to what I was. So I stayed silent while people suffered. That's my beloved, the ghost of my own moral failure, haunting every year I continue to exist." Margot reached across the space between their chairs and took Vivienne's hand. The vampire's skin was cool, but her grip was firm. "You're acting now," Margot said softly. "That has to count for something." "Does it? Can present action redeem past inaction?" Morrison seems to think so. Seeth finds peace eventually. Not forgetting, but acceptance. "I'm 208 years old, Margot. I'm still waiting for acceptance." February's selection was 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Silas had traveled extensively in South America in the 1940s and 50s, and his observations about magical realism, how it captured the way memory and myth intertwine, were brilliant. "The Buendia family's curse is that they remember everything but learn nothing," he said. Each generation makes the same mistakes because they're so caught up in their own narrative that they can't see the pattern. That's the opposite of immortality. We vampires remember everything and see all the patterns. Sometimes I think that's worse. How so? Thomas asked. Because we can't forget even when we desperately want to. Every conversation I've had, every book I've read, every person I've loved and lost, it's all there, perfectly preserved. The Buendias forget and repeat. We remember and still can't change. Margot had been growing closer to Silas over the months. After meetings, they'd often linger in the library, discussing books and life and the strange space between them. He was brilliant, funny in a dry way, and surprisingly vulnerable when he talked about his past. "What was it like?" she asked one night in March as they sat alone, the others having left. "Being turned." Silas was quiet for a long moment. "Terrifying. I was 27, a physician in London. There was a cholera outbreak, and I was working around the clock. One of my patients, she wasn't a patient at all. She was a vampire, pretending to be sick, looking for victims among the medical staff. She turned you. Without asking. Without explaining. I woke up 3 days later in a morgue, starving, confused, with no heartbeat and a desperate need for blood. It took me years to understand what had happened, to learn control. The vampire who made me, Celeste, she'd already moved on. Left me to figure it out alone. That's horrible. It was. But I survived. I learned. And eventually, I found others like me who helped me understand what I'd become." He looked at her. "I've had nearly 200 years to come to terms with it. Most days, I think I'm grateful. I've seen and experienced things no human ever could. But some days you wish you'd died in 1829? Yes." They sat in comfortable silence, the fire crackling. "Why do you keep coming here?" Silas asked suddenly. "To the club. You know what we are now. You could leave, go back to your normal life." Margot considered. "Because this is the most alive I've felt in years. My human life was small, predictable. This, discussing books with vampires, hearing about Oscar Wilde from someone who actually knew him, it's extraordinary. It makes me feel like the world is bigger and stranger and more wonderful than I ever imagined." "It is," Silas said softly. "But it's also more dangerous." "Are you dangerous?" His eyes met hers, gray as winter storms. "To you, I could be. If I let myself care too much, want too much. Vampires don't do relationships well, Margot. We outlive everyone we love. It's agony. Then why keep loving?" "Because the alternative is becoming like the vampires I knew in my early years. Cold, disconnected, treating humans as food or entertainment. I don't want to be that. So I keep choosing connection, even knowing it will end in loss." Margot's heart was pounding. What if it didn't have to end? "You're thinking of asking Vivienne to turn you. Is that so crazy?" Silas stood abruptly, moving to the window. "Yes. Margot, you're 28 years old. You have your whole life ahead of you. Becoming a vampire means giving up sunlight, children, aging alongside your loved ones, eventually having to fake your own death and start over every few decades. It means watching everyone you know die while you continue unchanged. It also means time. Time to read every book ever written, to learn languages, to travel, to experience things most people never will." "At what cost?" She joined him at the window. "You tell me. Do you regret it?" "Every day. And not at all. Both things are simultaneously true." Margot reached up, touching his face. He was cold, but not unpleasantly so. Like marble warmed by the sun. "I'm not saying I want to be turned tomorrow. But I'm saying, don't push me away because you're afraid of losing me eventually. That's going to happen regardless. We're both mortal in our own ways. You don't know what you're saying. Then teach me. Help me understand." Silas closed his eyes. "I can't do this, Margot. I can't let myself. She kissed him. For a moment, he was perfectly still. Then he responded, his hands coming up to frame her face, his lips cool against hers. The kiss was gentle, almost reverent, and when they finally pulled apart, Margot saw something in his expression she'd never seen before. "Oh, this is a terrible idea," he whispered. "Probably. But I'm tired of safe choices. What about next month? Next year? What about when you're 40 and I still look 27? We'll figure it out. Together." Spring brought new challenges. Margot's mother noticed the change in her daughter, the late nights, the secretiveness, the way she glowed when she talked about book club. "Are you seeing someone?" her mother asked during one of their Sunday calls. "Sort of. It's complicated." "Complicated how?" How could she explain? "He's older than me. And there are cultural differences." "How much older?" 224 years. "What?" "Sorry, I meant he's in his 40s. But he acts like he's much older. Very old-fashioned." The lies were getting exhausting. Meanwhile, the club tackled The Handmaid's Tale in April. Keisha's fury at the dystopia was matched only by Vivienne's chilling observations about historical parallels. "People think Gilead is exaggerated," Vivienne said. "But I've seen societies where women had no rights, where they were property, where speaking out meant death. The novel isn't a warning about a possible future, it's a reminder of a past that many want to recreate." "Did you ever try to change things?" David asked. "Use your power to fight oppression?" "Sometimes. I helped women escape abusive situations, funded suffragettes, transported people on the Underground Railroad when I lived in the States in the 1850s. But vampires can't solve systemic human problems. We can help individuals, but changing society requires collective human action." "That feels like a cop-out," Keisha said bluntly. "Perhaps it is. Or perhaps it's acknowledging our limitations. I can't age, but I also can't fundamentally alter human nature. Only humans can do that." The discussion turned to resistance, to survival, to the ways people maintain their humanity in inhumane circumstances. Thomas talked about teaching the novel to students who found it depressingly relevant. David mentioned corporate cultures that sometimes felt totalitarian. Eleanor spoke about living through McCarthyism, the fear of speaking out. And Silas, quietly, mentioned the patients he'd treated over the years who'd survived unimaginable trauma but still found ways to live, to love, to create meaning. "That's what Atwood captures," he said. "The resilience of the human spirit. Even Off-Red, trapped in Gilead, finds moments of connection, of rebellion, of hope. That's not naivete, it's the fundamental strength of your species." After the meeting, Margot and Silas walked in the garden behind the estate. Spring flowers bloomed in the darkness, their fragrance heavy on the air. "Your species," Margot repeated. "You said, your species. Like you're not human at all anymore." "I'm not. Not really. I look human, but I'm a predator wearing human skin." "Do you really believe that?" Silas was quiet. "Most of the time, no. I feel human, think like a human, care about human things. But then there are moments, when I'm hungry or angry, or when I move too fast and remember what this body can do, when I feel completely other." "Does that bother you?" "Less than it used to. I've had a long time to make peace with being in between." They sat on a stone bench beneath a cherry tree in full bloom. "Margot, I need to tell you something. Vivienne and I have been discussing the possibility of relocating. The club, I mean. We've been in Boston for nearly 60 years now. People are starting to notice that we don't age. Within the next 5 years, we'll need to move on." Margot's chest tightened. "Where?" "We haven't decided. Maybe Montreal, maybe London. Somewhere we can start fresh, build a new club." "And me? You could come with us. If you wanted. We'd help you establish a new identity, a new life. Or you could stay here, continue your career, find a normal relationship with a normal human who—" "I don't want normal." "You say that now. But ask yourself, are you willing to give up everything you know? Your job, your friends, your family? To live a half-hidden life with people who are fundamentally different from you? What if I asked Vivienne to turn me? Then I wouldn't be different. Silas stood abruptly. No. Why not? You said yourself vampires can survive ethically now. We don't have to kill. I could. You could watch your mother grow old and die while you stay frozen at 28. You could lose the ability to walk in sunlight, to have children, to grow and change as a person. Margot, I was turned without my consent. I would never ever inflict that on someone I care about. Even if I'm asking for it? Especially then. Because you're asking without fully understanding what you're requesting. I've met dozens of humans over the years who romanticized immortality. Most of them, if they'd actually received it, would have been miserable within a decade. How do you know I'd be one of them? I don't. But I know you haven't lived long enough to make that choice from a place of full understanding. Come back to me in 20 years, after you've experienced more of human life, and if you still want it, we'll talk. But not now. Please, not now. Margot felt tears burning her eyes. So what, we just have a few more years together and then you leave? Or you come with us as you are. Human. Mortal. Part of the club. And watch you stay young while I age. Watch you eventually lose interest because I'm no longer. I could never lose interest in you, Silas said fiercely. Age doesn't work that way for me. I've loved people in their 20s and their 80s. Physical beauty is such a small part of what makes someone compelling. Loved? Past tense. I've loved and lost many times, Margot. It never gets easier. But I keep choosing it anyway because the alternative, isolation, disconnection, is a kind of death worse than the physical kind. They stood there in the garden, at an impasse. I need time to think, Margot said finally. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere. Not for a while yet. May's book was 1001 Nights. Vivienne had chosen it specifically, she admitted, because it was about storytelling as survival, about the power of narrative to forestall death. Scheherazade tells stories to stay alive, Vivienne explained. Each night, she weaves a tale that's too compelling to interrupt with execution. That's what books have been for me, for Silas, for all immortals who don't want to become monsters. We tell ourselves stories, through reading, through discussion, through connection with others, to remember why existence matters. The conversation that night was about narrative, memory, and the ways stories shape identity. Eleanor talked about how reading had helped her process grief after her husband died. Thomas discussed teaching students to find themselves in literature. Keisha spoke passionately about representation and whose stories get told. And Margot, looking around at this strange, wonderful group, realized something. She didn't need to be a vampire to be part of this. The club would continue with or without her. New humans would join, would age out, would die. The cycle would repeat. But the books would remain. The discussions would continue. The bridge between mortal and immortal would stand. After the meeting, she found Vivienne alone in the library, replacing books on shelves. Can I ask you something personal? Margot began. Of course, dear. Eleanor. You turned her, and then she chose to become human again. How did you bear that? Watching her age, knowing you could have kept her with you forever. Vivienne's expression was tender. Eleanor was my companion for 83 years. We traveled the world together, built 3 iterations of this club in different cities, loved each other in every way 2 people can. And then, one day, she told me she was tired. Tired of watching humans age and die. Tired of the weight of memory. Tired of being frozen while the world changed around her. What did you do? I cried. I raged. I begged her to reconsider. And then I helped her find a witch who could reverse the transformation. It took 6 months, and it was agonizing for her. But she emerged human again, aged to what she would have been if she'd never been turned. 72 years old, with gray hair and laugh lines and all the beautiful marks of a life lived. Do you regret turning her? Never. Those 83 years were precious. And the 15 years since have been precious too, in a different way. I've watched her experience things she'd forgotten. The simple pleasure of food, the warmth of sunlight, the anticipation of a future that has a definite end. She's happy, Margot. Truly happy. And that's what matters. Does she regret it? Becoming human again? She says no. But sometimes I catch her looking at me with this expression, and I wonder if part of her misses it. The strength, the time, the freedom. We don't talk about it. Some things are too complicated for words. Margot sat down heavily. Silas says I should wait 20 years before asking to be turned. That I can't understand what I'm choosing at 28. He's right. But he's also wrong. There's no perfect age to make that choice. I was 35, and I still wasn't prepared for what it meant. Silas was 27 and spent his first decade in misery. The question isn't whether you're old enough, it's whether you're choosing it for the right reasons. What are the right reasons? That's something only you can answer. But I'll tell you this, if you're choosing immortality to be with someone, to avoid loss, or because you're afraid of aging, those aren't good enough reasons. You need to want it for itself. For the experience of existence across centuries, for the chance to witness history, for the opportunity to grow in ways humans can't. And you need to be prepared for the loneliness, the disconnection, the weight of watching everything you know disappear again and again. That sounds terrible. It can be. It's also extraordinary. Both things are true. Margot thought about that. About Scheherazade spinning stories to survive. About choosing to exist, despite everything, because the alternative was worse. I think I need to stay human, she said slowly. Not forever, maybe. But for now. I need to live my human life fully before I can make a decision like that. Vivienne smiled. That's very wise. And Silas. I love him. Or I'm falling in love with him. But I can't build my whole existence around that. It wouldn't be fair to either of us. Does that mean you're leaving the club? No. God, no. This is the most important thing in my life right now. But it can be important without me changing my fundamental nature. Right. Absolutely right. June brought The Summer Solstice and The Little Prince by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. It seemed like an odd choice for a group that usually tackled weightier fare, but Vivienne insisted. This book is about love, loss, and the things that make life meaningful, she said. It's about seeing with the heart instead of the eyes. That seems appropriate as we approach a transition. Margot's stomach dropped. Transition. Silas and I have decided. We'll be leaving Boston in September. The club will disband here, though we'll start a new iteration wherever we settle. The news hit harder than Margot expected. She looked around at the faces that had become so familiar. Thomas, Keisha, David, Eleanor. This strange little family. What about everyone else? Thomas is retiring and moving to California to be near his grandchildren. Keisha has accepted a position as a department head, which will keep her busy. David is transferring to his firm's New York office. And Eleanor. Vivienne smiled at the elderly woman. Eleanor is writing her memoirs. All of them. Really. All of us, Eleanor corrected gently. This club has been precious, but it's time for new chapters. Pun intended. The discussion that night was about impermanence, about the little prince's rose that was special only because he devoted time to it, about the fox's wisdom that taming means creating bonds that will cause pain when severed. One sees clearly only with the heart, Silas quoted. Essential things are invisible to the eye. I've lived long enough to know that's true. The connections we make, the love we share, those are what matter. Not because they last forever, but because they change us. He was looking at Margot as he said it. After the meeting, as everyone said their goodbyes and made plans to exchange email addresses, Silas pulled Margot aside. Walk with me. They went to the garden again, to the cherry tree that was now heavy with fruit. I meant what I said in there, Silas began. You've changed me, Margot. This past year, getting to know you, sharing books and ideas and moments. It's reminded me why I choose to keep existing. You make me feel human again. I love you, Margot said simply. I know it's only been a year, and I know you've loved others before me, and I know you'll probably love others after me. But right now, in this moment, I love you. Silas pulled her close, and she could feel he was shaking slightly. I love you too. So much it terrifies me. Because I know how this ends. I've lived it before. You'll age, and I won't. You'll want things I can't give you. Children, a normal life, a partner who exists in sunlight. And eventually you'll die, and I'll carry the memory of you for centuries, perfect and unchanging, while I continue on. Or, Margot said, I come with you, not as a vampire, as myself. I get a new job in whatever city you choose. I age naturally. We have whatever time we have. And when I die, you'll remember me, not as someone frozen at 28, but as someone who lived a full life and chose to spend part of it with you. You'd do that? Leave everything. Boston isn't everything. My job is just a job. My mother will visit wherever I am. And the chance to be with you, to be part of whatever new iteration of the club you create, to keep discussing books and ideas with someone who actually met Oscar Wilde. Yes, I'd do that. It won't be easy. Nothing worth having is. They stood there beneath the cherry tree, mortal and immortal, both of them choosing love despite knowing it would end in loss. We should read The Little Prince together, Margot said. Really discuss it, just the two of us. Which part? The part about taming. About how love is worth it even when it means future pain. About being responsible for those we've tamed. Silas kissed her forehead. You've certainly tamed me. September arrived with autumn leaves and new beginnings. The final meeting of the Boston iteration of the Eternal Book Club was bittersweet. They'd chosen Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro, and Vivienne's stories about actually attending the book launch party added depth to their understanding of the butler Stevens and his repressed emotions. Kazuo wrote about the danger of letting life pass you by while you wait for the perfect moment, Vivienne said. About choosing duty and propriety over love and connection. It's a very British form of tragedy, but it's universal too. How many of us have made that mistake? Everyone was quiet. I did, Eleanor said finally. For the first 50 years of my vampire existence, I didn't let myself love fully because I was afraid of loss. And then I met Vivienne, and I learned that love is always worth the risk. Even though it ended? Thomas asked gently. It didn't end. It transformed. I'm still here, aren't I? Still part of Vivienne's life, still part of this club. Love doesn't have to be romantic or eternal to be real. The discussion wound through themes of regret, of duty versus desire, of the small moments that add up to a life. David talked about leaving his firm to start his own practice, taking a risk he'd been afraid of for years. Keisha announced she was writing a young adult novel. Thomas showed them photos of his grandchildren. And Margot shared that she'd accepted a position at McGill University in Montreal, where Vivienne and Silas would be relocating. New city, new club, Vivienne said with a smile. Same goal, to bridge the gap between mortal and immortal through literature. Anyone who finds themselves in Montreal is welcome to join us. As the meeting ended, they took a group photo, the last record of this particular configuration of people. Vivienne printed it out immediately using an old Polaroid camera, and they all signed the back. Margot tucked her copy into her bag, next to a first edition of The Little Prince that Silas had given her, inscribed with a quote, "It is only with the heart that one can see rightly. What is essential is invisible to the eye." In November, the new Eternal Book Club held its first meeting in a historic building in Old Montreal. The members were different, a mix of humans and vampires Vivienne and Silas had known over the years, plus some new faces recruited through carefully worded invitations left in used bookstores and library donations. Margot took her seat in the circle, now familiar with the ritual. Wine, or blood, was poured, books were opened, and Vivienne welcomed everyone. This month's selection is Beloved by Toni Morrison, she announced. A novel about how the past haunts us, how trauma lives in the body, and how love can be both salvation and destruction. Let's begin. As the discussion started, Margot looked around the circle. An indigenous vampire who'd survived colonization and wanted to discuss Morrison's treatment of historical trauma. A young trans man reading his first serious novel and eager to understand the academic perspective. A middle-aged woman who taught literature at Concordia. An elderly vampire who'd known Harriet Tubman personally. Different people, same purpose. The eternal conversation continuing. Silas caught her eye from across the circle and smiled. They'd moved into a small apartment near the university, finding a rhythm that worked. His night shifts at a hospital, her days in the rare books collection, their evenings filled with literature and discussion and the quiet joy of choosing each other daily. She didn't know how long it would last. 20 years. 40. However long her human life allowed. But she knew that every day was a choice they were both making, consciously and with full awareness of the cost. Later, after the meeting ended and most members had left, Margot and Silas stayed behind to help Vivienne clean up. "You know what I realized?" Margot said as she gathered wine glasses. "Every book we read is about the same thing, fundamentally. How to live with meaning in the face of mortality. How to love despite loss. How to find beauty in impermanence. Or how to find meaning in immortality," Vivienne added. "The questions are the same, just stretched across different timescales." "That's why the club works," Silas said. "Because at our core, mortal or immortal, we're all trying to answer the same questions. Books help us compare notes." Margot thought about that, about Scheherazade telling stories to survive, about Dorian's portrait aging while he stayed young, about the little prince's rose that was special only because he devoted time to it. "Next month is my pick," she said. "I think we should read The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay." "The Michael Chabon novel?" Vivienne raised an eyebrow. "Why that one?" "Because it's about art and escape and the stories we tell to process trauma. Because it's about two people creating something meaningful together despite impossible circumstances. Because it's about choosing to live fully even when the world is ending. Because—" She looked at Silas, at Vivienne, at this strange new family she'd found. "Because it's about how love and literature can save us. All of us. For whatever time we have." Vivienne smiled. "Then that's what we'll read." And so the Eternal Book Club continued, as it had for 200 years, as it would for centuries more. Different members, different cities, different iterations. But always the same core truth. That books bridge the gap between mortal and immortal, that stories help us understand what it means to be human, or to remember our humanity, even when we're something else entirely. In the quiet library, with snow beginning to fall outside and the fireplace crackling warmly, 3 readers, 2 vampires and 1 human, settled into their chairs with books in their hands and eternity stretching out before them, measured not in years but in pages turned and discussions had and moments of perfect, imperfect understanding. And that, in the end, was enough.